Hey, Michael here with our Bible in a Year weekly update. We've just finished week 2 of our reading. We spent most of last week in the book of Job. I don't know about you, but I found it a little bit intense at times. Lots of grumbling going on. It's been a week looking at righteousness and suffering and confusion and wrestling with God, and thankfully kind of interspersed in it some little moments of sarcasm and humour as well. But it has been full on. The cool thing is that on Saturday we get to the good bit at the end of the book where God answers Job out of the storm, and we have this amazing kind of dialogue between Job and God, mostly God speaking, which is just hugely uplifting. I find it's often one of my go-to passages to read when I'm feeling a little bit down. But I'm doing this video on Friday and we haven't quite got there yet. We've just reached the end of Job, who has decided that his 3 friends are useless at helping him make sense of what has happened to him. And when we read this book, I guess we are almost like a fly on the wall, aren't we, between this conversation going on between these friends. So it's not like pure theology in the sense that this is exactly what God's like. It's people trying to figure out who God is in the midst of stuff. So we're listening to other people trying to figure out who God is. And I don't know about you, but as I've been a fly on the wall in this conversation we've been reading, I have been reminded so much of times when I've been in these conversations with friends as well. Times when I've sat and either I've been the one that suffered, or they've been the one that suffered, and I reach the end of myself, and there's no words and there's no thinking that can really help. And you end up going round and round the houses, sometimes trying to remind ourselves who God is, like Job. At points he kind of flashes into going, I know my Redeemer lives. And then he pulls out of that and goes into, but maybe God just wants to squish me because, he's not a very nice person. And I just think Job has been an amazing textbook of what it means to wrestle with God. Like, we often talk about the Psalms being an amazing example of lament and figuring out who God is, and struggling with that. And we often look to David as this great example of how to worship God in the midst of pain. But I think Job's just as good. Like, reading it this week has just made me think Job is great at this. And what I love most is the fact that Job is considered a righteous man. So God says right at the beginning to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? He is righteous, he is faithful, and God's really proud of Job at the beginning of the book, and he's really proud of Job at the end of the book. And actually, what we get is the impression that Job's wrestling and Job's questions are not just okay, but that God is somehow proud of it. So even though we're about to get to the bit where God answers Job out the storm, and there's aspects of it that I guess are a little bit of a reprimand, God never tells Job off for wrestling. God just reminds Job who he is. And I love that. Job's anger is okay. And it's actually, if you want to put it in these terms, it's an act of worship. When we worship stuff, it's about ascribing value, it's about ascribing worth, it's about saying that something is good or great. It's about drawing attention to that. So when we get annoyed with God, essentially what we're saying is, I'm frustrated because I believe you are good enough and powerful enough and have enough authority to do something about it. So why won't you do something about it? And when we say that, when we get frustrated with God, we are ascribing value to him. We are actually expressing worship to him. I've had a few good rants at God in the recent months, and I've discovered that actually sometimes these are the most precious and most valuable times that I have with him, because I almost drop the act and I kind of, I let the facade come down. I just go, here is the deepest frustrations of my heart. And what I've discovered is that he speaks to me too out of those storms, that God has been faithful and has, in the midst of my pain, in the midst of my frustration, he speaks into it and he reminds me who he is. And sometimes he speaks kindness, and sometimes he, draws me into a place of silence, but he always speaks to me in that place out of love and out of goodness. And I just think reading this week has been a precious reminder that we have a good Heavenly Father who is really happy for us to wrestle out our relationship with him and our fears and our concerns and our frustrations. And really that's why community as well is so important. that and honesty and vulnerability is so important to faith, that we are able to be fully us and fully vulnerable with the people around us who can walk in that and guide us in that too. Anyway, that's been my reflections. Would love to hear yours. Comment in the video on the video below, or send us an email. Keep going, keep reading. We want to hear more stories about how you're encountering God as we work through His amazing Bible in 1 year.